Hello, everyone, and welcome to Drawing Down the Stars. I'm Snappy, and today I'm joined by a good personal friend of mine, Graham Cwinn. And we're going to be talking about a really important artist and magician and cultural figure, Antonin Artaud. So there's kind of an interesting story to this discussion that I wanted to relay just to kind of like set the scene here. And that is, we've been doing this study with Amon and a bunch of people where we're going deep into the mysteries. And we're looking at this idea called, or this symbolism called the Orphic Vox, which is like a symbolic language that's identified by Otto Kern that the Orphics use. And it's a way to try and like see where we have these references to the Orphic mysteries across history. What's interesting about the Vox, though, it doesn't just end when the Greek period ends. Poets and artists maintain this symbolic language, across history. Like we see it being done by the Romantics, like Lord Byron and Percy Shelley and various others, Mary Shelley, for example. And one of these people that we came across while studying this, Rob came across, is this figure of Antonin Artaud. And we were just amazed by his artistic ability and his magic. And at the same time that we're discovering this Artaud connection, I'm becoming friends with Graham through playing Dungeons and Dragons. And Graham just happens to be this massive Artaud like stan and is posting all these quotes and has showing off his book collection. I'm like, wow, so this is a message from the muse. I need to sit down with Graham and I need to have a conversation about Antonin Artaud. Like, who is this guy and what's actually going on? So, Graham, why don't you introduce yourself and talk to us about who Antonin Artaud is to you, and then we can get into your discussion.
Sure. So, as we mentioned, my name is Graham, and I'm a poet and artist and musician. I discovered Artaud back in university. I studied theater, and he came up in a couple lectures, and I was just fascinated. So I wanted to learn more. I did some essays and some deep dives. And I started to not only identify with his psychological struggles, which he spoke of immensely, but also with his sense of mysticism and how his pursuit of magic ultimately fulfilled his life, in a sense. And it's this odd juxtaposition of this despair and then this life-affirming need. And it just deeply inspired me to the point that I would say it saved me through some of my darkest points in my life.
That's so beautiful. Wow. I'm excited to learn more. So so how do we understand, just to set the scene, who's Artaud like as a figure to history? What does he represent to the world of theater and to the world of art?
So that is a bit of a big question, but
yeah, I know. Just try to give
in a nutshell, Artaud, along with Bertolt Brecht and the Futurists, I would say, kind of one of the figures of 20th century theater. He was performing and conceiving of a style of theater that we might call postmodernism today, in the terms, in sense of how he blends different elements of direction of lighting and where the audience is and the connection to the audience. And he not only did theater, he also wrote poetry and essays, and he did many drawings as well later in his life and radio broadcasts. So he really was a jack of all trades in a sense, but he really came through into public knowledge within the world of theater.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, and just like I've heard that he's kind of like his imprint is sort of all over film and like the later development of film, and you kind of like you didn't really have modern film without his ideas and his idea about breaking the fourth wall and playing with these ideas of audience and stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Kind of really massive contributions to just pushing the boundaries of artistic expression within theater, right?
100%. And as you mentioned, also in film as well, which we'll be getting a bit more into that at that part of his journey. But he was very influential in the world of film and cinema as well. He acted in 20 films.
Oh, wow.
Including Napoleon and The Passion of Joan d'Arc. Those were his two biggest film sort of appearances. And he wrote many essays about film, and he wrote 15 film scenarios. I have a collection of them, and they're quite fascinating.
Right. So this is someone who's really taking film seriously as an artistic expression right from its early inception, which was kind of unheard of because it's very much a pop art at the beginning, That's interesting. But okay, so that's really interesting. So we're seeing this figure of Artaud, who's this kind of giant in the theater world. What is his background? Where do we begin?
So to start, his real name is Antoine Marie Joseph Artaud. Antonin is a nickname. It means little Antoine, I believe, to differentiate him from his father, who had the same name, if I recall. I could be wrong on that. People can feel free to correct me. But he was born in 1896 in Marseille. And when he was quite young, this is a bit important, he contracted meningitis, which was not very well treated at the time, and he was seeing double. And this concept of doubles will appear many times throughout his work. And he eventually recovered, but he continued to persist with these psychological torments, to the point that he had many nervous breakdowns, and as a teenager, he was moved to many clinics. And the important clinic would be in 1917, he was in a Swiss clinic under the care of Dr. Dardel, who encouraged him to write and draw. And he was under his care for, I think, 2 years. And during this time, which was also important to treat his nervous anxiety, this doctor prescribed opiates, which precipitated his lifelong addiction to opiates. And this will come up in much of his writing and his letters.
So this is really interesting. Okay, so what we're seeing is we see this youth who has this fairly troubled background. He has a real hard time fitting in. He gets meningitis. This causes him to have this kind of break that exacerbates everything. He goes to this institution, and the institution kind of inspires him, right? It gives him that artistic expression. And as much as opium is going to play an issue in his later life, this is also something that's like a psychedelic, right? That's expansion of the mind. That is also going to be very opening artistically to him at a very young age. Wow. Okay. Interesting.
Yes, and he does talk about his connection between opium and creativity, and how sometimes it helps him, sometimes it hinders him if he is suffering from withdrawals.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1919, he left the clinic. The doctor felt that he should strike out on his own. So he moved to Paris.
How old is he? Do you know around this time?
1919, he was born 1896. So about 25, I guess.
Okay. So he's just so that's a late start, he's kind of living his early adult life in institutions. Okay. That's a bit sad.
Yeah, and that will reflect in his later life as well. And so he struck out on his own. He moved to Paris and started gaining theater experience, and so that he could make a living as a film actor, as we mentioned briefly. And during this time, he published his first book called Celestial Backgammon. This is one of his works, one of the only ones that I haven't read, actually. But it has been described by many people as sort of a series of stilted quasi-surrealist lyrics.
Okay, interesting.
And the surrealist element will be important in a moment. So he wrote this Celestial Backgammon, and then he initiated a correspondence with a man named Jacques Rivière, who was the editor of a literary magazine, La Nouvelle Revue Française, which I'll just call the NRF for sake of use. And he approached him with some of the poems from the Celestial Backgammon, and Jacques Rivière he was intrigued by the poems, but felt that they were, lacking something to publish. They're not quite mature enough. Mm-hmm. And so Artaud defended himself, explaining that in this correspondence, he explains that something or some force, like a void, was robbing him of thought and preventing him from truly expressing himself, and therefore rendering him non-existent.
That's
Because
incubus or succubus kind of spirit.
yeah, absolutely. And he embellishes this into a fantasy world a bit later in his life, but for the moment he just refers to it as the void, or like a thought blocking sort of force. And he says that he explains that he suffers from a mental disease. And he says, words, the forms of phrases, inner directions of thought, the mind's simplest reactions. I'm in constant pursuit of my intellectual being. And he believes that these ideas, even that he presents, even though they aren't perfect, they're all he has. And without them, he couldn't prove that he himself was like a real human.
Okay, it's kind of like I think, therefore I am sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
And so this correspondence ended up being published. It was Jacques Riviere's idea to publish all these letters that they sent back and forth as a collection. And this is what kind of put him onto the map and introduced him to Parisian artistic society.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. So in 1925, the first two books that I've read, he released them in the same year, Umbilical Limbo and Nerve Scales. And they're explorations of consciousness and creativity, essays on life and death, suicide, drugs, religion and art, poems.
So okay, so way before he becomes a theater person, he's kind of like a Parisian intelligentsia, I guess you would call him.
Exactly.
What
He hasn't discovered his avenue to theater at this point yet in his life journey.
Still had managed to cause such a scene in the art world that people are willing to buy his ramblings. But I mean it in a good way, but like he's writing this kind of philosophical, poetic literature. That's interesting.
Absolutely. And it drew so much attention that he was invited by a man named André Breton into the surrealist group. André Breton was sort of the spearhead of the 1920s Parisian surrealist scene.
Okay.
And they had very fun
magic coming out of surrealism, so.
Yeah, and they have very similar forms of expression, and I couldn't paraphrase it well, but I have a book called Watch Fiends and Rack Screams by Clayton Eshelman, and he describes their connection here perfectly. If you don't mind,
yeah, of course.
He says, the surrealist contempt for bourgeois value and their fascination with ritual, subconscious, dreams, and trances excited the ambivalent poles in Artaud that despised society and affirmed the possibility of drawing upon this rich vein of African, Eastern, and esoteric Western materials, which via surrealism were making their way into the poetic conscious of the 1920s. So this would have been his first introduction to magic and occultism, was through the surrealists.
Right.
Which he began to deeply explore later in life, but this was sort of his first.
And I just want to set the scene for people who aren't aware about the surrealists. Several of the most important magicians of the 20th century have come out of the surrealist movement. I think of people like Eiffel Calhoun, a lot of the people who are in the Golden Dawn, like William Butler Yeats. Anyway, lots of surrealist artists. There's a lot of overlap there. Dali was notorious for doing magic. So yeah.
Yeah, very fascinating group. A lot of what their aim was to explore the unconscious and the expression of the unconscious in art to understand more about the self and your world around you. To sort of dumb down surrealism in a nutshell. So he engaged with them for a couple years. He helped ran what they called the Surrealist Research Center, which was a facility where people could come to retell their dreams and they would transcribe them. I don't know too much about it, to be honest. It's hard to find a lot of literature about it, but it seems quite fascinating. And it was eventually closed to the public and then shut down entirely. And he helped edit the first two volumes of the official surrealist magazine called La Révolution Surréaliste. Sorry, Mary, accent isn't the greatest. And he edited it and wrote most of the third issue, which focused a lot on, I believe, suicide and different philosophical interpretations of that.
Okay.
And so during this time where he was engaging with the surrealists, as I mentioned, he published Umbilical Limbo and Nerve Scales,
And this is
where
more like philosophy and essays, right? Yeah.
philosophy and essays, yeah, he sort of discards the poetic form for more of a literary fragment sort of style.
Okay.
And he relentlessly complains of being paralyzed or abyssal or absurd, that he is without works, a language, or a mind that he can respect. But he seems to refuse to bypass or transcend this negativity because he feels that within his turbulence there's a power that if he could harness, it would transform him and put him at one with himself.
Oh, wow.
And so that's a lot of what Nerve Scales talks about. He says, there is a luminous point where all reality is rediscovered, only changed and transformed by a nucleus of the magic use of things. So even in 1925, he's talking about magic and its importance to use it to connect to yourself.
Yeah, and he's already, it sounds like he's having these very monistic connections as well, like in that earlier passage you read. So, wow. So he's already connecting and making these very kind of metaphysical, mystical connections. Okay, interesting.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depends how you look at it, his continued involvement with commercial film and at this time his increased interest in the theater, this bothered André Breton and many of the surrealists, because at the time commercial film and theater were viewed as being products of the bourgeois and very profit oriented and sort of like a rich way to come and pass the time and forget about yourself. Which was not what Artaud believed at all, and we'll see that he creates a theater entirely opposite to that. And furthermore, the surrealists were moving to align with the French Communist Party, which was something that Artaud could not accept, because he believed that the true revolution is beyond any specific political alignment or faction. And so this all culminated in him being officially expelled from the surrealists. They released a statement in their magazine saying that he is no longer with them, and they sort of attack him, accusing him of bestiality and other types of depravity. Yet curiously, he maintains a relationship with André Breton for like the next 20 years. So they have a strained relationship that I don't really want to get into too much, because André Breton kind of pisses me off, and it sort of is aside to the point. So I think it's important to talk about cinema right now, because this was sort of the bridge between cinema into theater.
Okay, yeah. So what is, like, at this time? What time are we talking right now? Anyway,
so in late 1920s to early 1930s.
So
is when he was acting.
Okay, so is he acting mostly in like short silent films then, right?
Yeah, they were all silent films at this point. They weren't. He talks about the emergence of the talking film and how he doesn't really like it and thinks it's a perversion of cinema. He believes. Yeah, very interesting. I would have to dive back into that essay, but what I want to talk about is he has an essay called "Witchcraft and the Cinema," where we see him applying an almost mystical and magical component to film. Where he says that the cinema has an unexpected and mysterious side, which we find in no other form of art, because even the most arid and banal image is transformed when it's projected on the screen. The smallest detail, the most insignificant object, assumes a meaning and a life which pertain to themselves alone, independent of the value of the meaning of the image themselves. So he's talking about a duality, layering of images that can be found in cinema, and how you can derive a magical element by referring to something without talking about something without talking about it, right? As
Right. No,
these
that's really profound because, okay, just an aside, it makes me think of in the Orphic tradition, there's this whole idea of divine image, where the image becomes the most important thing. Okay, so the idea is you're supposed to project the deity within your mind's eye, or you create a piece of art that's representative of the deity to connect you to that image, to that thing beyond. So you perceive the eidolon, and through that perception, you get to the deity, which is, so the idol in a sense is the deity, but also isn't the deity, So it really reminds me of this play with images. There's always this double understanding with the image in the Greek tradition, where it's like there's the divine idea like that exists as a form, and there's the physical thing that it's tied to, right?
Absolutely. And excuse me, as we'll see a bit later, like this concept of doubling is very integral to his beliefs and his work. And we see that kind of here, where there's the image and then they represent something like a higher truth that
Right.
he's referring to without, it's almost like it's too sacred to speak of openly.
Exactly. Or it's too profound it's too profound to reduce to words, right? It has to be, but you can perceive it through, so that's like very very magical. Okay.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to bring that up. And only one of his film scenarios was ever produced. It was called The Shell and the Clergyman. The film title is The Seashell and the Clergyman. It was released in 1928, directed by Germain Dulac, and it's actually considered to be the first surrealist film.
Oh, interesting. So
yeah,
doing like Dali and his stuff.
Yeah, so he was, very, very important in the world of cinema. The obsession of a clergyman, his obsession with a general's woman, and his strange visions of death and lust as he struggles against his own eroticism. And the film itself, I really think they chose terrible music for it. I think the music score really takes away from it. But if you read the scenario itself, is quite powerful. I think it's quite easy to find online now.
I have to look into it because immediately my mind goes to the Bacchae. Are you familiar with the story of the Bacchae?
Only briefly. I read the play The Bacchae in one of my university classes in theater.
Well, one of the central things is this understanding that the Dionysian rites are erotic, they're sexual, they're desirable. So even as the king, he's like spurning everyone and he's dismissing Dionysus, he can't help but be drawn into the rites to his own demise. He knows they're going to destroy him. He goes anyway and he gets ripped apart, and it's like he succumbs to his own erotic desire. That's his great feeling.
Absolutely. And oddly enough, Artaud throughout his entire life was very anti-sexual. And he explains later on that he believes because of the magical component of sexual acts, he believed that people were performing rites through sexual magic that were confining him and preventing him from speaking the truth about reality. Which we'll talk a little bit. I think that's more for part 2, maybe. That's more business stuff. But it's very.
Just out of curiosity, do you believe he's like asexual or aromantic? Like, does he have any kind of love connections in his life?
So he did have a few romantic connections with people, but it was to my understanding, based on his letters, they were non-sexual connections. They were, they had a deep love, but he was very, like you said, maybe asexual or and he practiced this asceticism very strictly in his life.
It's really interesting. So with a lot of these kind of aesthetic monks, there's this talk of something that's called the eros of distance. Okay, so it's this understanding of having this lusting after God or after deity, or this lust for the divine. that you can never actually fulfill and never receive. So it becomes this kind of pure experience, and it's that unreciprocated love becomes the most celebrated form of like chasing after like the muse or the divine. Do you see any of that reflected in Artaud?
He, in the theater in his double, he specifically says that eros is a form of cruelty when he's describing the theater of cruelty, because it's the need to be drawn to it, but also being repelled by it, and the
So okay, that's amazing, because most people do not understand the dual nature of eros, because eros in the Greek myth, one of my favorite deities, and it has a dual function. It is the force that brings people together for love, right? But it's also the force of separation. So at the beginning of time, what causes Phanes, Dionysus to rip themselves apart is eros, right? So eros is violence on one hand, and it's the worst thing imaginable, and then it's the best thing on the other, right? It's that double image you again, in this polar image you get in a lot of this Orphic stuff.
Absolutely. And that doubling really comes across in this, the only other scenario that I want to mention, called 18 Seconds. And it thematically, so basically there's a man at a street corner, and he's filled with anxiety, and he looks at his watch. The screen zooms in on the time, and then he goes back to standing there. And then he looks at his watch again. 18 seconds have passed. And then he pulls out a gun and he shoots himself. But what we see is that the images that play in his mind during those 18 seconds take almost 2 hours to portray on film, because he's living this entire interior world of torment and passion and anxiety that is there's a dual image of the 18 seconds that have passed in real time, and the 2 hours it takes for him to the 2 hours that it takes for us to process the visual images that are flowing through his mind, sort of to show the dual nature of time and our own perspective.
Wow, that's really profound, and it's deep. It also makes me think, because a lot of, he was doing opiates, right? And a lot of the magi who are doing a lot of opiates or doing things like salvia, they talk about extending time, and going, and trying to and living lifetimes, while in these states, these magically induced states. So it's interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, that definitely probably played into how he portrayed this. So in 1926 is when he really got into theater. So he founded what is called the Alfred Jarry Theater, or the Théâtre Alfred Jarry. And Alfred Jarry was a symbolist writer. He was a bit before Artaud's time, and he sort of was creating sort of proto postmodern kind of weird sort of deconstructionist almost stuff, where actions and movements are broken down into very stylized movements. And he produced a couple plays, or wrote a couple plays. So that's why it is named after him, as sort of an homage to his artistic boundary pushing.
Okay.
And so Artaud founded the Alfred Jarry Theater in 1926 with Roger Vitrac and Robert Aaron, who were Roger Vitrac was also a surrealist who was expelled for his pursuit of theater, and very, very bizarre. So they staged only 8 productions between 1927 and 1929. There were 4 large productions and 4 sort of smaller scenarios. And this is actually what I studied in university, and this is how I was introduced to him, was through these reading about these productions.
Okay.
And because they would eventually the performances lay the foundation for what he would expand into the theater of cruelty. So he sort of commenced a systematic onslaught on the theater as it stood at the time. So he's
So
criticizing.
what do you mean by onslaught? So what is he
He's
doing? Like,
writing these scathing manifestos,
okay,
condemning modern theater at the time for being complacent and full of sort of living room drama that was, he mercilessly satirized it, and verse drama was ridiculed, and he created the stage as a place of provocation.
I see. Yeah, for
To
sure.
make a statement that he was creating a theater that is nothing like the theater that we have now, because the theater that we have now has lost its magical element compared to ancient traditions.
Well, this is important, right? Because
Very important.
the theater comes out of the Dionysian mysteries. The word tragedy means goat song, right?
Yes,
And it has to do with these morals that would be sung by the choruses, right? At these plays that would be performed. But what's always profound about tragedy is that there it's a the center of the Bacchic Dionysian rite is this experience of Pan, the panic or the all, right? It's to understand the totality of being. And one of
yeah,
the things that they understood is that fear prevents you from moving forward. It prevents you from experience. It doesn't allow you to appreciate the world, and it will paralyze you. So they understood tragedy as a holy divine act by engaging in the worst, most culturally horrific themes. You destroy and dismantle that horror, by look. It's almost, it is kind of, it's like this. Nietzsche talks a lot about tragedy, and it's really good to try to understand. Like, he has a deep understanding of it. It's this, like, through this death and this horror, you are reborn again into this more realistic understanding of the universe. You face your fear, and you can move forward understanding that the universe is antagonistic. It's
exactly.
like really intense experience, right?
Yeah, and so he actually takes that metaphysical terror and personifies it on stage in the form of dismemberment. And
Oh, okay. I just gotta. Oh my god! I don't know how I didn't notice, because dismemberment is the central thing for Dionysus, right?
exactly.
He's ripped apart constantly. They say it in the Orphic rites. It's sparagmos. Okay, wow. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
It's fascinating. And so he's dismemberment was used by the Jarry theater to depict an underlying mental state rather than the bloodshed itself. And they did this by using large, life-sized, fully sort of anatomically like moving puppets or
Okay.
mannequins. And they could physically dismember these puppets on stage to represent this rending apart, this metaphysical terror.
Oh, wow.
And he says in one of his essays, this anxiety, this guilt feeling, this victoriousness, this satisfaction set the tone, feelings, and state of mind in which the audience should leave our theater, shaken and irritated by the inner dynamism of the show. And this dynamism bears direct relation to the anxieties and preoccupations of their whole lives.
Wow.
His writing is so profound. I get lost in it.
That's profound.
Yeah, and so he says in this way, by presenting this metaphysical element into theater, theater will stop becoming a game and an entertaining way of passing an evening and will become a useful act, restored to the status of therapy to which the mob in ancient times used to flock to regain a taste for life and the strength to resist the blows of fate.
Exactly.
Tying back to what you were saying.
Right. It reaffirms, this is someone like Schopenhauer didn't get it. He thought that it shows you how life is meaningless. No, it reaffirms life. It reaffirms the struggle of life, and it shows you that what you fear can be it's real. It's tangible, right? It's interesting.
And so he wants to refer to the theater. He wants audiences to come into the theater to understand that they're going to be undergoing an operation. an operation not only of the mind, but the very senses and flesh. And he says, from then on, they will go to the theater as they would to a surgeon or dentist in the same frame of mind, knowing that they will not die, but at all the same, this is a serious business and they will not come out unscathed.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so they were, despite there only being 8 performances, and they weren't very widely attended because the surrealists actually staged protests outside of the theater.
Holy shit! What is with these communists?
I know, to deter people from attending these events. So because of this, there were some elite, important theater figures who attended, and that's why we still feel the repercussions and the ripples of these performances today. And the eventually Roger Vitrac and Artaud had some divisive arguments, and because of lack of funding, it's very hard to fund productions, and he was struggling with addiction, right, which was undermining his ability to fund a lot of these performances.
I can't imagine it was cheap to build a giant dismemberable puppet that was anatomically correct.
Definitely not. So unfortunately, in 1930, it officially came to an end, but he continued to write and pursue his theater of cruelty, what he then called it from then on.
Okay.
And this is like sort of the big part of what we're going to be talking about, I think, because he wrote the theater in its double. That was published in 1938, a bit later, but he wrote all of the content of it in the 1932 or 1933.
So this is like a collection of essays and ideas, basically all his ideas and thoughts of the theater at this time, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so the concept of the double is a bit complex. He's referring to life and how life and art double each other, but he's also referring to the plague, oddly enough. He senses in both forces, the theater and the plague, creative upheaval and renewal, in the sense that the plague is a demolishing force from which new life can fester and flourish.
There's that you get that polar energy. Not only does he have the double where you get in the Orphic with this image and the original, and then you also have this idea of the polar, which is like there is no evil in the Orphic conception, right? The fire and death, it just rebirths things. It's like it's a transformation. Wow.
Absolutely. And something that he really hits home in these texts is the metaphysical pursuit and magic. And he explicitly states, right in the beginning of it, he says, we need to live, first of all, to believe that sorry, that's not what he says first. First he says, if our life lacks brimstone, a constant magic, it is because we choose to observe our acts and lose ourselves in consideration of their imagined form instead of being impelled by their force. But no matter how loudly we clamor for magic in our lives, we are really afraid of pursuing an existence entirely under its influence and sign. And so that's how he opens the theater in its double.
Jesus, there's so much
pack.
There's so much there, because again, immediately it brings me to this idea of that image. He's clearly connecting to this divine image that exists beyond, and he's like, that's what you need to be fixated upon. Wow.
And he is sort of calling out society as well for being now afraid of magic and seeing it as something inferior, whereas really it can be a tool to really enhance our lives. He says that it's a protest against the idea of culture as distinct from life, as if there were culture on one side and life on the other, as if true culture were not a refined means of understanding and exercising life.
Wow. Yeah, this guy's a magus.
He really
understood things. Oh wow. Like, yeah. No, but like that really just kind of sums up this whole understanding of magic as this as the artistic creation process, of this process of self-evolution as well, right? Of self-refinement and of turning you as the artistic expression. It's wild.
Absolutely. He in his first in his book Umbilical Limbo, he says, to paraphrase, I do not consider any form of art as distinct from life. So life, to Artaud, life is art, art is life. They don't imitate each other, they are each other, different aspects of the same existence.
Wow.
And so later in the theater in the double, he gets into what he calls metaphysics in the mise en scène. And for people who aren't theater goers, mise en scène is a overarching, it's a bit difficult to summarize, but it's an overarching term to describe how the lighting, the music, the stage direction, the set, how everything except the text comes together to create an image. And at this time, in the 1920s, he was saying that theater was dominated by dialogue, and it has dominated, taken precedence over the mise en scène. Whereas really, he was saying that it is through the mise en scène, or the direction and how everything is presented, that that's where the ritual is incorporated. And the text can be used to supplement that, but that it's about creating these powerful, striking images that will shake us to our core.
That's really that immediately makes me think of there's these Indian philosophers called the Rasas, or these are the Indian aesthetes, who are really obsessed with like appreciating art as like the totality, to experience the divine. Artistic appreciation and creation is the highest form. And they talk about this understanding of myth where you can't just read a myth. You want it to be performed for you. You want to see the image. You want to have the sound. You want to have the taste. You want to engage with it so that it becomes fully alive. And then by doing that, you actually can experience. It's the understanding is that you could relive what was happening in the myth as a real lived experience, you know, and you can have a conversation with the myth as if it were a living being.
100%. And he isn't saying that language and text needs to be like demolished or destroyed. There are some art forms in theater, in this deconstructionism and futurism, where they create a different language that's based off of broken phonemes. Is not really something like that. He wants to return language, he says, to consider language as a form of incantation. He specifically says that. And this idea of language as incantation presents itself very fully in his later works. But it's, you know, the language is a way of unlocking connecting the audience to the images that they're seeing. In a sense.
That's so Orphic, because like this idea of the language again in the song that you sing and knowing the right phrases, right? And this is why if you look at magic, why is it called a spell? Because how you spell it is the most important, right? It's not enough to want something, right? It's all about how you ask for it, you know?
Absolutely. And there's a section in this called No More Masterpieces, where he sort of criticizes Sophocles and Oedipus Rex, because of the language that is used. And he says, a public that shudders at train wrecks, that is familiar with earthquakes, plagues, revolutions, and wars, that is sensitive to the disordered anguish of love, can be affected by all these notions and asks only to become aware of them, but on the condition that it is addressed in its own language, and that its knowledge of these things do not come to it through adulterated trappings and speech that belongs to an extinct era that will never live again. So he's saying that because people are a little bit ignorant and blind doesn't mean that they don't want magic or mysticism in their lives. It's all in how you present it.
Right, and I think he's attacking this idea of the sacred cloud. It's not so much Sophocles. It's this, because I mentioned Sophocles is writing for a Greek audience.
Sophocles is an example.
No, but like if we're reading Sophocles now, we're so removed. We're removed from the language. We're removed from history. How do we perceive those images? You know, whereas like someone like Artaud, he's saying, I want to use the language of the working people, you know, of their world and of their reality, so that we can actually engage with on that equal understanding, right? You don't want to be browbeating people.
100%, 100%. And so to bring into all of this is the concept of cruelty, which is, you know, the theater of cruelty. That is the name of his theater style. And he isn't referring to sadism or bloodshed, at least not exclusively. There is violence, but he says the point is not to be constantly pulling out the butcher knife on stage, but to reintroduce into each theatrical gesture the notion of a kind of cosmic cruelty without which there would be neither life nor reality. And so when he says cruelty, he's referring to many things, but from my understanding, quite what he's trying to direct to the public is that life and our experiences eventually create almost like a lens, a distorted lens through which we perceive ourselves in the world. And he wants to create a form of theater that will shatter that lens and help people rediscover who they truly are. And once everyone sees them for who they are, the world will change.
Wow. It's again super Orphic, just because I keep thinking like the Orphics have this understanding that we don't perceive reality as it is, and that we have to go through this death and rebirth experience in order to see the true reality, because we are shaded, we are colored by the perceptions that we place upon this. Like I think about all this all the time. Like today I was out hiking, and I went way deep out into the woods, and I kind of like walked off the beaten path, you know, and I got just a little bit lost for a second. And, you know, and then I realized, wait a second, I'm in the middle of actual nowhere, you know, and you realize like the natural world is this uncaring, unfriendly place, you know, and like it's a totally different reality than our cities and our homes. You know, when you're in these places, there's a realness and a rawness there that you have to, like, if you make a mistake, nature will just consume you, you know, without care or without worry. And I think it's especially in our modern times, like definitely in Artaud's time, but even more so now, it's easy for us to be totally removed from any sense of like fear or violence of our surroundings, you know?
Absolutely. And so to not like reiterate the entirety of his manifesto, which is describing what this production would look like, because he talks a lot. We've been talking a lot about ritual in theater and transforming theater. So just to quickly touch on a couple elements of the production. Firstly, there would be almost a minimalist or non-existent separation between audience and performer. He wanted the audience to be seated at the center of the stage. And ideally, in his ideal world, the audience would actually be in mechanical seats that could rotate to follow the action on stage. So because they're surrounded by the world and its trappings. So he wanted to sort of, as a way to direct them through this madness in a sense, or this chaos, give them a sense of direction so they can
have
find
to follow. Yeah.
Exactly. And the set pieces would often be very minimalist. Quite often they'd be weird, large statues, human body parts. They'd be interacted with by the actors as props. The lighting would create almost a mirage of emotions. He often utilized projection. So projecting images onto the walls of the stage. And
so cool.
the costumes would be used in a way that the actors would almost represent hieroglyphs or universal elements that are separate from the actor than the characters themselves.
Oh, wow.
And the acting would consist of almost like hyper exaggerated motions bordering on pantomime, kind of reminiscent of the deconstructionist movement by Meyerhold in Russian theater. And through this simplistic execution, there would be a ritualized motion and almost dance-like movement that in conjunction with the hieroglyphic costumes would incorporate the ritual element back into the production. So you have two layers. You have, again, the double. You have the drama that is acting on stage, and then the greater drama of the symbols clashing, reacting, separating, coming together.
Wow. And I just keep thinking, like, all the stuff he's removing and all the stuff he's doing, he's bringing it back to a more traditional form of theater that you would have seen in Greece. There weren't these separations between the stage, really. They weren't like, the costumes would be minimal. The dialogue would be often these poetic songs, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, wow. Very profound. Yeah, he's going back to that it's tragedy by another name, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And he actually was part Greek. His mother was Levantine Greek, so it's kind of not surprising that he would explore that aspect of his personal culture, right?
Right.
And to try to discover that and reintroduce that into what he wants to do. And so in 1935, he staged an adaptation of Percy Shelley's The Cenci. And this was...
Percy Shelley is really important because this is another one of these poets we've identified who's using this Orphic vox. So this means that Artaud knows that someone else knows what they're talking about, is highlighting them, right? Like that's wild. Okay.
Yeah. And so this was his first real theater of cruelty attempt. And he produced it 17 times in 1935. And it incorporated many of the elements he described in the theater in its double and his manifestos, like the production that we just described. And I don't know if people know much about the story of Count of the Cenci, but he was a very, according to history, very cruel man. And he was a count, and he sort of used his power to manipulate and take advantage of people.
Where was the count from?
I'm not entirely sure. I should have researched this.
That's okay. What was the name again? Count what? Sorry, just to be clear.
Cenci, Cenci. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not entirely sure. I've only seen it written. But the important part of the story or the drama is that these Cenci, sorry for this is a bit triggering for people, but he raped his daughter, and her and her stepmother conspired to have him murdered. And this plot was uncovered, and the daughter and mother were actually sentenced to death.
Oh, wow.
And so he is playing on two levels of cruelty here. One of them being he often referred to incest in his works as being a form of sexual cruelty, because again, eros is cruelty, and it's the cruelty of the love for something that you cannot have.
Right.
And it's also a cruelty because it's almost like a victim shaming scenario, where someone who is harmed is seeking to validate themselves and find retribution, and in that they themselves are actually punished, even though that they were trying to defend themselves from being tormented.
Wow.
So that was the production. He staged it 17 times. Again, because of his lack of funding from his ongoing addiction, it was very difficult to maintain the productions. And also, the French theater going public was a bit more unexpectedly dull and ignorant, I think, than he expected. And so while there were people who appreciated his work, it wasn't until later on that he really became culturally embraced, and we see the ripples of his work.
So he's too radical at this point, kind of thing.
Yeah. So people like Susan Sontag, in her introduction to one of my books, she calls him an icon of failure and madness. But I don't think he really failed. I think that his works have persevered and persisted to this day, to the point that we're even talking about it now, shows that he was actually quite successful.
Just a different kind of success, right? It's not that
Exactly.
monetary
Didn't see
success.
success in his lifetime, but he was celebrated near the end of his life as well. And so something really important during this time, in between his manifestos and this production of the Sensi, he was approached. He was very poor during this point, and so he would take on writing projects to sort of live. To live, and in 1933, he was commissioned to write a biography on Heliogabalus, and
Oh,
so he ended up writing
who commissioned
Heliogabalus.
who commissioned this? Like, who would want a biography on Heliogabalus?
The publisher Denoel was their name, and I don't know why they approached him to write about this.
So
But
for those who don't know, Heliogabalus is a Syrian deity. It's widely considered to be like a version of Saturn. It's also called Elagabalus. It's very famous because this was the deity that was brought by the Emperor Elagabalus to Rome. And then later they formed the cult of Magna Mater out of this. But yeah, powerful kind of Saturnian deity that's connected to this black stone and to the cross-dressing, possibly trans emperor Elagabalus.
yes, and he talks a lot about how Elagabalus or Heliogabalus fused the masculine and feminine into one androgynous or hermaphroditic being, like a true being, a true expression of what a human is, which is quite interesting. And it was during this time that he really dug up a lot of information on the occult and primitive mythology and mysticism. And not primitive, that's the word of the person I'm sort of paraphrasing.
It's for lack of a better term, we'll say.
Right? Yeah, and this really fed into his evolution of the theater of cruelty. So this book project was actually very integral to finishing his theater of cruelty and actually carrying it out. And he even says that this is the opening statement in it. I dedicate this book to the manes of Apollonius of Tyana, Christ's contemporary, and to any meaningful, truthful Illuminati in this fleeting world. And in order to underline its profound unreality, its spirituality, its futility, I dedicate it to anarchy and to the war for this world. And I dedicate it finally to the ancestors, the heroes in the classical sense, and to the spirits of the great dead.
That's wow. Wow.
So right on the nose is how he opens up the book.
Apollonius of Tyana, that's interesting, right? Because that's one of the Magi. Some people consider them possibly Jesus. Either way, they were a very influential figure. They're famously trained in India and learned the Indian magic and were persecuted for it when they came here because they were all about this idea of like individual apotheosis, that you can become like one with the all, right? This does not mesh well with the Roman emperors who are like, we're divine beings. The average Joe can't become a god. And meanwhile, Tyana's running around being like, everyone's a god, you know? That's cool. What a deep state. This guy was really, really connected, you know, and to write a biography on a Roman emperor, like how much reading would you had to have done? Wow.
Oh, he poured for months and months, poured over books and documents, and just spent a long time in libraries. In the edition of Heliogabalus that I have, which is, I believe, the only full English translation by Infinity Land Press. And one of his friends describes him during this period in her journals. She says, Artaud sat in the Coupole Cafe, pouring out poetry, talking of magic. I am Heliogabalus, the mad Roman emperor, because he becomes everything he writes about. In the taxi, he pushed back his hair from a ravaged face. The beauty of the summer day did not touch him. He stood up in the taxi and, stretching out his arms, pointed to the crowded streets and said, the revolution will come soon. All this will be destroyed. The world must be destroyed. And this belief in the destruction of the world is a theme that will appear heavily in his letters and his writing shortly on until the end of his life.
So I want to highlight again, this is another Orphic theme, an Orphic idea. So there's this understanding in the Orphic Dionysian kind of Saturnian thing of this flipping of the poles, okay, of the polar opposites, and how you have history is a series of cycles that eventually what happens is you have a new idea that comes about and it starts to unfold, but eventually it starts to calcify and die. And then you, at that point, you have an apocalypse moment. Either whatever is being destroyed sheds its skin and is reborn, is transformed, or it dies, right?
Yeah.
And this is really what an apocalypse moment is. It's that possibility. Either you're reborn or it's a final. But either way, you're going through a death, you know?
100%.
But
And
what's understood is important is that the apocalypse is not necessarily an end, right?
it is not necessarily an end, exactly. It is something that can bring the potential to spring forth a new life, a new creation.
Exactly.
And so he doesn't go into too much detail he describes a lot of the rites and rituals that Heliogabalus or Elagabalus was inducted into as a child. And he sets up an important context, which is that of Heliogabalus, not as a madman, as historians brand him or brand them, but as one in whom these rituals have been ingrained since birth. And this dark mysticism is all he knows, and it informs his actions and his decisions.
That's a really beautiful point, because when we do look at the history, he's born into the cult of Heliogabalus and is the head priestess from the day, or head priest from the day he's born. You know, can you imagine what a life like that would be? And then you become emperor.
Right? At like 14.
Just wild.
So he describes here, he is thrust onto the temple steps and is made to effect rituals his mind can't grasp. He officiates with 600 amulets that form girdles about his body. He whirls around the altars consecrated to the gods and goddesses. He absorbs rhythms, chants, colors, and multifarious notions. And a day comes when everything coheres, when the sun's blood fills his head like dew, and each droplet of solar dew becomes an energy and an idea. And because of this, he says that Heliogabalus was a magus, born among rituals, and he partakes of their powers.
Wow. Well, you know, everyone who's watching this should go watch Neil from Gnostic Informant. He does a really good deep dive into Heliogabalus, Elagabalus, and he actually talks about them as basically being one of the most important emperors, because the shift in religious ideas that happens as a result of him bringing the cult of Elagabalus to Rome, it eventually leads to the whole Sol Invictus cult. It transforms the entirety of how Rome understood everything. And some people even say, like, that's the beginning where Christianity could set in, you know?
Absolutely. And I'm going to have to watch that, because I would really like to learn more about him. I studied a bit of Roman history in university, but not from this period. So I'd really like
is also hard to study, because most of what we have written about them is clear polemics, you know? So it becomes this big, huge thing. Like, all these people are claiming they're doing everything at any cost to transition their gender, you know, and maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It's really hard for us to say, because this would have been such an offensive thing within the Roman period, right?
Absolutely. I think my argument maybe against that and towards an argument of a unity of the sexes is that he himself, while many of these people would undergo ritual castration or the removal of their phallus, he himself did not partake in that ritual. He wasn't removing the masculine from himself or from themselves. They were merging the masculine with the feminine into one being that can be representative of both. That's just my personal opinion. That's just my personal what I've gathered from it. But
I think you're also onto something, because there is a lot of this the center figure of all of these cults, right? The god Elagabalus themselves, not the character. The god is a hermaphrodite.
Exactly.
Right? So why wouldn't the man Elagabalus want to reflect the god Elagabalus, right?
Absolutely.
So,
And one of my favorite quotes from Heliogabalus is this: to have a sense of of the profound unity of things is to have a sense of anarchy and of the effort required to reduce things while restoring them to unity. Whoever has the sense of unity also has the sense of the multiplicity of things, of that dust of appearances through which one must pass in order to reduce and destroy them. And
wow.
so again, he's talking about how Heliogabalus takes all these elements and fuses them into, reduces them to their pure form of expression, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
well, again, right? The center idea of the mystery is you have to embrace the totality of the all. You have to experience right? Panic. Here's the idea, okay? To experience the all is to die, right? So you want to be reunited in the one, but to be reunited in the one is to lose all sense of self. So you have a panic. This is terrifying. You don't want to go through with it. But if you go through with it, you experience the all and you realize that the death was nothing but a transformation, you know. And so it's learning to overcome that fear through experience, right? You need that
yeah,
panic, you need that cruelty, you
it
know.
feeds us. It can sustain us. And
Exactly.
there's actually a whole chapter in the book called The War of Principles, where he's talking about the raging battle of the masculine and the feminine, and it eventually culminates in a unity. And he goes into descriptions of the actual etymology behind the name Elagabalus and Heliogabalus.
Okay.
Which is quite interesting. I didn't it's a bit too dense for me because I'm not as well versed in a lot of this ancient mysticism, but it's quite fascinating. I think I highly recommend that people pick up this book and read it because it's profound.
Mhm.
Um, and he says that really Elagabalus or Heliogabalus was their life was poetry in motion. Because in poetry there's an essential contradiction. It's pulverized multiplicity and produces flames. And poetry, which restores order, revives disorder with semblances ablaze. It causes appearances to clash in restoring them to one singular point of fire, gesture, blood, cry. So it's
Wow.
sort of like reducing, it's a primal expression of poetry in the rituals and acts that Elagabalus carried out.
Yeah, that's powerful stuff. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that Artaud is deeply involved in this Dionysian understanding of the world. Like it's everywhere. Wow.
It's everywhere you look, and it becomes even more apparent in his later work as well. Because I'll just briefly mention for people who don't know much about Artaud, he was in many asylums and underwent something called electroshock, and he died during this experience. And he was proclaimed medically dead, and then came back to life, and was almost like experienced that Dionysian rebirth, you know. Uh,
Wow.
and that's when he emerges really as a truly magical being. And so, but I think he has a few more steps of trials
Okay.
and tribulations to go through before we get to that point.
So where does he go from Heliogabalus then?
From Heliogabalus, basically that just shortly precedes his production of the Sensi, which, as we know, kind of didn't really work out. And for many in his situation, the options would either be to make a parallel move into a different art form or to destroy themselves through increased drug intake and malnutrition. And, when you're faced with this desperation and failure. And completely instead of that, he decided to leave France entirely and go to Mexico.
That's kind
Um,
of a wild move. What inspires him to go to Mexico?
He believed that in Mexico, he would not only discover a viable revolutionary situation which would welcome his ideas, but also discover indigenous ritual that would enable him to once and for all to quote here, to penetrate the dead crust of European society and engage in the origin of culture. So he believed that he could tap into an still existing indigenous culture.
So this is something we see with a lot of these figures who discover the Orphic Vox, where they eventually recognize that it's within the, again, for lack of a better term, primitive societies that these rituals survive, and that this dynamic cultural production is present, and there's often either people trying to revitalize these things, or they're going to these places to connect with these more ancient traditional ways of approaching spirituality.
Exactly. And he went to Mexico specifically because he felt that even though much of the original Mexican culture was destroyed by the Spanish conquistadors, this was a time when a lot of indigenous people were reclaiming land and wealth was being redistributed. And he felt
Right,
that
you have the rise of the communist and anarchist movements, right? We still have the Zapatista anarchist movement in Mexico today,
There you go. I was not aware of that. So he felt that he believed that the myths of Mexico, of the Mayan race, their blood is starting to speak out once more. This blood that was silenced was still, he describes it as boiling beneath the earth, in the entrails of the earth. And he wants to tap into that rich, fertile mysticism. And so he gave a series of lectures in Mexico City that were very well received. He condemned Marxism, proposing instead a revolution based on fire, magic, and anatomical transformation. And this concept of anatomical transformation will emerge at the end of his life in something he calls the body without organs, which is a very important aspect to his work. And Deleuze actually references this in his post-structuralist writing.
That
Which
sounds
is
so deep. Oh, wow.
very
But
fascinating.
we'll hold off on that. We'll get there next
We'll stop that, yeah. And so after giving these lectures, Artaud decided he wanted to meet with some real indigenous culture. And so he somehow managed to get a government grant from the Mexican government and traveled first by 750-mile train trip to Chihuahua. And then he spent a week traveling across the Sierra Madre to meet with the Tarahumara's. They were a native population, supposedly completely removed from Spanish conquistador culture. And he especially chose this group of people because of their ritual use of peyote. And he immediately attributed superhuman powers to peyote, believing it to be at the core of the Tarahumara resistance to colonialism and the Indians' ability to survive for hundreds of years in this barren wilderness. And
So does he have experiences with peyote? Does he go through any of the peyote rites?
He does. I'd like to talk about that.
Yes, please.
So just before he gets there, he wants to approach these people with a pure body, mind, and spirit. And because of this, he attempts to detoxify from opiates, and he throws away his heroin, all of his heroin, and travels through the desert with a horse for a week, where he suffered from withdrawal and dysentery.
Jesus, dude.
Yeah. And he describes as being spellbound by the Tarahumara landscape, which appeared saturated with these hybrid forms of like beings that he interpreted as like gods living still in the earth. And he eventually arrived at this village. I'm not going to begin to attempt to pronounce it because I don't want to insult anyone. But he was housed with the local school teacher, who was also the region's government representative. And unfortunately, he was actually opposed to native ritual, including the use of peyote. But luckily for Artaud, there was a tribesman who had recently passed away. And through pressure of the local community, finally the school teacher consented to a peyote ritual. And Artaud had to wait 28 days. And he has an essay called The Peyote Dance, where he describes the entire experience in its entirety. And you can find it in the Artaud Anthology by Jack Hirschman, published by City Lights, but it's also in a collection called the Tarahumaras, I believe, and which is a collection of all of his writing about this time period. And by the time he actually took the peyote, he was complaining of being utterly exhausted, and that this old, terrible emptiness that he felt in Paris was returning to him. And at first, he's disillusioned. He's not very impressed with the peyote because it hasn't taken effect yet. And he says, for having come so far to find myself at last on the threshold of an encounter and of this place I'd hoped so many revelations from, and then to feel so forlorn, so empty, so uncrowned. Had I ever known joy? Had there ever been anything in this world, one single feeling, not of anguish or of inexpiable despair? So he's feeling this crushing psychological pain again, just as he's about to take this peyote. And nevertheless, he says, as the night drew on, a vision possessed him. And he says, beauty, bonfires rose on all sides in the sky. Below, the dancing had already begun. And confronted with this beauty at last achieved, this beauty of imaginations radiant as voices in an illuminated cave beneath the earth, I felt that my efforts had not been in vain. So he did have some sort of profound experience during this ritual, and he goes to extensive detail describing every aspect of it. I'm not going to do that because I think people should read it for themselves. It's quite interesting. But in a later piece called the New Tutaguri, which is another name I think for this ritual, he says, I don't know if it's because the wind is rising now, or if a wind has arisen from the music from another time, which is still persisting today. But you feel as though whipped by a gust from the night, by a breath of air that's risen up out of the vaults of an abolished humanity, and which came to show its face, a face which is painted, a figure that is grinning and merciless. So he must have had some profound, metaphysical, terrifying, but also empowering experience.
Yeah, just something very real. Wow.
Very real experience. And so ultimately his journey to Mexico was quite successful. He was well received by his lectures about this new culture and new revolution, and he experienced this beautiful ritual with these indigenous people. And so he returned to Paris shortly after, and he continued to waver towards mental disintegration. He decided that his name had to disappear and insisted that his account of the Tarot Chimera's adventure, which was printed in La Nouvelle Française, he requested it to be printed anonymously, curiously enough. And in another work, the next work that we'll be talking about, called The New Revelations of Being, he signed it simply, or not so simply, as The Revealed One. And by this point, he's moved into prophetic anonymity and involves himself in tarot card interpretation. And he's increasingly detecting magical signs and omens everywhere he looks. So magic is very much now coming into the forefront of Artaud's mind.
Wow, it sounds like he had this experience of the all, right, when he was in Mexico. And that experience, now he is having trouble identifying with himself. Like no longer identifying with everything else, you know?
Exactly.
Wow.
Very profound. And so I don't know much about tarot, admittedly.
So one interesting thing I want to, because I study tarot, and one thing that I just immediately think about is that how the tarot is originally supposed to represent sort of that primordial language. Okay, so the idea with the tarot is each of the cards is a divine image, and it's supposed to be one of these like primordial images that's kind of beyond language. So these would have been at least they're supposed to invoke the images that would have been present before the Tower of Babel, and this idea of getting to this primordial form of communication, so you're working on this primal symbolic level. So all of the symbols kind of exist as divine beings, and they represent these kind of primordial signs.
Okay, that's fascinating, and that makes a lot of sense with what he talks about in the New Revelations of Being, which I have. It's in a book called The Death of Satan and Other Mystical Writings. Oh, cool. Which is where I found his writing on Mexico as well. and it's a really fantastic collection. It's a bit rare. I wish they would
Mhm.
reprint it, but I believe that actually later this year, Infinity Land Press are going to be doing a new translation of the Revelations, the new Revelations of Being,
Oh,
which was
cool.
which was written in early 1937, and based on the tarot is an apocalyptic manifesto. And Artaud predicts the end of the world, which he claimed would occur on November 7th, 1937. And he wrote this book, I believe, in June, of 1937. So only a few months after this prediction, he thinks the world is going to end. And he initially talks first about the void again, saying, I felt the void for a long time, but for all that time, I refused to throw myself into the void. I've been cowardly like everything I see, because I know that I needed to be illuminated by the void, and I refused to allow myself to be illuminated. Um, uh,
Wow.
which is very neat. And so he talks predominantly in the New Revelations of Being about actually a return, a war between man and woman, and the masculine and the feminine, and how the world will come through a unity of these into creating a new being that will usher the end of the world, and from the end of our world, a new world will emerge.
Okay. It just keeps getting more and more Orphic here, more
I
Dionysian. So,
know. I
so
was
there's
really
this.
interested to see what you would say about this topic.
So again, you have this polar thing, and this flipping of the poles within the understanding of the Orphic rites, is that you have this divine kind of, you have the chthonic force versus the Olympian force, okay, and like the Olympian is more of this patriarchal, it's more ordered, technological, and versus the chthonic, which is more natural in nature, right? And these two things are in this constant cycle. And what history is like, some times of history one is in charge and then the other's in charge, and you get this constant flipping. They describe this through the descending of these these kings. So the first primordial king is the Titan Uranos, right? Uranos, he gives birth to all the other Titans. And then Kronos, his son, rises up and kills him, and then eats his phallus and becomes
Yeah.
the new king. But then famously, Kronos brings about the golden age where everyone lives in this peaceful harmony. But eventually Kronos also becomes corrupted, and he sees into the future, and he sees that fundamentally he's going to be destroyed by one of his children. So in a panic, he consumes all of his kids, right? But Rhea, his wife, swaps in the Umphalo stone, and Kronos eats that instead, and Zeus is ushered away, right? Where he goes off and he drinks this magic goat milk to become super strong, and then kills Kronos, and he eats the phallus. Or what they don't often talk about is the next part in that story, because this is all revealed in the mysteries and is all deeply occluded. There's this understanding of this divine child to come, okay, which is supposed to be, again, this bigendered hermaphroditic being. And sometimes they even describe it as a chimera. So to also be neither animal, man, or not male, female, or animal, something, an amalgamation, something greater than. There's always this understanding that these apocalyptic moments cause evolutionary change, right? If you don't die, you're reborn into something greater. So within the Greek, you have this constant fighting between the male and the female. So it only makes sense that at the end of the mystery, they're reunited in this new child to come, right? That's how you resolve this conflict eventually.
Yes. Absolutely. And he even says in the work, he says the sexes will be separated for some time. Human love will become impossible, and this work has already begun. And it means that woman will return to man. So he's prophesied again. He's prophesying this merging, this unity, and it's very interesting. He goes through a series of predictions and then explains what he means, or what he interprets from these predictions based on the tarot. And he kind of concludes by saying, on the 3rd of June, 1937, the 5 serpents appeared, who were already in the sword, whose strength of decision is represented by a stick. And this means that I, who am speaking, have a sword and a stick with 13 knots. This stick bears on the 9th knot the magic sign of a thunderbolt. And 9 is the number of destruction by fire, and I foresee destruction by fire. And this destruction will be radical. So he actually, shortly during this time, he was actually gifted a cane. So he's talking about a physical, real cane at this point. And he was told that it was the cane of St. Patrick. And he starts, which I believe was a gift which was passed down, I believe was used by Jesus at one point in the St. Patrick myth. And I could be wrong on that, but that's what I've gleaned from my reading about this.
There is all of this weird magical symbolism because St. Patrick drives out the snakes. Okay, and we know that snakes are a magic, like snake venom is used in the rites. The snake is often associated with the staff of Hermes, the staff of Asclepius, right? The Ouroboros. So there's something weird and magical going on with St. Patrick for sure.
Absolutely. And so he starts attributing all of these magical implications on this cane and starts believing that this cane will actually bring about the end, the apocalypse that he's describing. And because of this, I'm assuming, no one knows exactly sure why, but from August to September of 1937, he decided to travel to Ireland, where he believed he could witness signs of the apocalypse, where he could return the cane of St. Patrick to his proper place. And by doing that, it will bring a final end to the world. And so he's traveling to Ireland, perceiving himself as this prophetic, he calls himself the madman or the fool, or the tortured one, which then he says has emerged as the revealed one, or the one who's been enlightened. And he wants to enlighten people and talk about the apocalypse. And for some reason, he decided to do this in Ireland.
Wow.
So there aren't many letters that survive from this period, but they have all been collected in something called 1937 Apocalypse, which is once again published by Infinity Land Press. They're very passionate about bringing his work into the public again, because it's just so important. And I have a few books from them. Fantastic publications. I highly recommend them.
Support Infinity Press, people.
Yeah, I got to support my fellow presses, as I also run a poetry press. So he comes to Ireland. His by this point, his religious preoccupations were becoming increasingly violent, and this kind of resulted in a series of altercations with the police while he was there. But during this time, he wrote so many letters to lots of friends, to Andre Breton, his friend Anne Manson, and a few others. And I'd like to kind of talk about the content of some of these letters, if that's okay.
Of course.
So he says, first of all, that the world is going to have to bleed as payment for the crime of having been knowingly misled about nature and reality. So he's saying that humanity has become... We've put blinders on, and we turn a blind eye to the true, powerful, mystical element of life. And he believes that it's gotten to the point that only through violence will this realization come. And
this is a constant theme you see with a lot of these dragon figures, these people with the Orphic Vox, because within the Orphic understanding, right, you have to experience violence in order to change. That's the whole purpose of violence. Violence exists in order to cause change.
Absolutely. And he says that paganism had everything right, but men, who are always utter bastards, betrayed the pagan truth. And whoever doesn't want to understand this truth, I'm going to smash them in the face this time, because this truth is going to have to be imposed by force for everyone's good. And then he follows that by saying, it's likely that I'm going to be put in prison some time from now, which is very prophetic, because that does end up happening. And he says that he says to Andre Breton, I've told you before that I read in the tarot cards I was going to have to get in a fight against justice, but that I didn't know if justice was going to beat me down to a pulp or if it was going to be me who beat down justice. So he's talking about this conflict, this struggle with revealing the truth, and he doesn't know if he himself will survive his ordeal.
That's intense. And this is all happening when he's in Ireland. So he's kind of like in Ireland, having a mental breakdown, looking for signs of the apocalypse, running around with this magic cane. What do the Irish people think of all this? This can't be good for Artaud.
So he was not well received. There was a lighthouse operator who let him stay with him for quite some time, and he had a very kind and warming relationship with this lighthouse owner. A lot of the children in the village would throw stones at him, calling him the funny little Frenchman. They didn't understand him, or they'd run away from him because they were a bit afraid of his eccentric sort of behavior. Overall, what's interesting is that this entire 2 months that he was traveling, he didn't have any money. So he was living in hostels for the homeless and like facing starvation and barely eating, sending letters to friends in Paris to request money so he could eat and stuff. And eventually this he says to his friend Anne Manson, I now have to reveal to you that in a few days I will be speaking publicly in the name of God himself, because there is a secret to my life and in my birth. I will be speaking in the name of the second state of the universal manifestation, the state of the destruction of all forms, and for the transformation of forms and the sublime in them. That means speaking for the state of the disappearance of being and the return to the absolute of all beings, which is known by Brahmanistic Hindus as Shiva, and who is incarnated in the person of Christ himself. So it's invoking Hindu mysticism, blending it with Christian apocalyptic prophecy. Very interesting. He really borrows from a lot of mystical backgrounds, but then creates his own spin on them.
What's really interesting, though, with all of this is that Shiva is very arguably a Dionysian figure. The Greeks argue that Shiva and Dionysus are the same, and some Hindus argue the same thing. The largest surviving Greek epic is called the Dionysica, and is all about how Dionysus travels to India to go wage war and show that he's the one true Dionysus, and it's from the East.
Wow.
or not from the East, he's from the West. So like there's ongoing understanding of the parallels between these two figures. And then Christ very clearly comes out of this Hellenized Jewish milieu, of which the Orphic and Dionysian rites are central, So both of these figures, even though on their surface, if you don't understand the deeper levels, they appear disparate. It all makes sense if you're looking at things as Artaud would, from this kind of Orphic point of view. Shiva and Christ and the Brahman, all of this are the one and the same,
Absolutely. And later on, when he sort of emerges from these asylums, he refers to himself as Artaud Shiva Christ. He is the embodiment of this destruction that will bring a new world. Which is very neat. He very takes these elements and incorporates them into his own personal myth that he's developed over time.
Right. So what happens? He's freaking out in Ireland. He's telling this girl that he's going to make this public speech.
Yeah, and so no one knows the exact details, but on the 18th of September, there's an incident where he has an altercation with the police, and he's severely beaten, and this cane of St. Patrick was either confiscated by the police or lost during the struggle. And he was arrested in what's known as Milltown Park, and they interrogated him in prison and for a couple weeks, and eventually they deported him.
When does he get arrested by chance? Do we know the day? Does it
Yeah,
correspond to his?
15th is the exact day of his arrest.
Okay, so it doesn't. I was just wondering if it corresponded to his apocalypse when he thought the world was going
Very
to end.
close, only off by a couple months, a month and a half, really.
Because it sounds like this is a personal apocalypse that he saw. You know what I mean?
That's what I was about. That's exactly what I was about to say. His visions of the apocalypse were a prophecy of his own destruction, and this destruction and his later rebirth, as to what I call Artaud the sorcerer, is something that I think we can really deep dive into in our next discussion. But so he is interrogated by the police. They send him away as an undesirable. He's deported back to France, and now it comes into a he said, they said sort of scenario where while on the ferry back to France, to the port Le Havre, he is involved in a violent altercation with the workers on the ship. He claims that they were threatening to attack him, and so he responded with violence. And upon arrival at Le Havre, he was detained, and they restrained him, and he was sent to the nearby asylum at Le Havre. And they kept him in a straitjacket, tied to a bed for 17 days.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and this is just the beginning of his torment. I think that we have some time maybe to get into the asylums if you're okay with it.
Of course, we can keep going.
Whenever we need to, just let me know to wrap things up.
For sure.
So he was in a straitjacket, fastened to a bed for 17 days. From there, he continued on a journey that would. He was in consecutive asylums for almost nine consecutive years. And so he was shipped around from Le Havre.
So, I'm just trying to. So he's on the port at Le Havre. He's taken into custody. They're bringing him back to stand trial, right? And while on the boat,
trial, I think they just sent him to an institution.
So he freaks out. They beat the fuck out of him. They don't bother to try him. No one really sees him. They assume he's crazy and dump him in this asylum. And this asylum people, they don't do much but lock him to the bed in a straitjacket for 17 days.
Yes.
Jesus Christ.
It's pretty barbaric. And on October 16th, this would be 1937 still, he was transferred to a larger facility called Quatre-Mers, and it is here that he was officially institutionalized. And he had no official documentation on him. And because of his onset of psychotic delusions, he presented himself with a completely different identity.
So what did he tell them?
I can't remember the exact name that he presented himself as having, but he said he was Antonin Artaud. Artaud was his mother's maiden name. And he says that he was a Christian who was being persecuted for his religious beliefs.
Oh, so this just complicates and makes things worse for him.
Completely complicates things. And his mother took a long time to actually figure out where he was because he was registered under this different name. And she eventually finds him, and he's so delirious that he doesn't even recognize her. And he's in this institution for 5.5 months. And then his mother is able to have him transferred to what's known as Saint Anne, which is in Paris. So it's a bit closer to home now.
Do we know what he's been diagnosed with? Like, when they finally institutionalized him, what did they say was wrong with him?
Here, he was declared chronically and incurably insane, with an unknown delirious condition. And he was when he was at Saint Anne, he was actually held in solitary confinement for 11 months.
That would break anyone. 11 months?
Absolutely anyone. I myself, to interject with some personal experience, I've been in psychiatric emergency for 5 days before, and that's a windowless room, nothing around you. There's a camera watching you, and there's a bed which has restraints in case they need to restrain you. And other than leaving to go to the bathroom, there's no light of day. I was in this room for 5 days before I was transferred to a ward. So just 5 days was torment. I can't imagine being in an isolated situation like that, separate from the world for 11 months.
It's unimaginable cruelty. Like, wow.
Unimaginable cruelty. I was in a ward for 5 weeks, and that was hell. So I can't imagine what he went through. I can, to a certain extent, but not,
Right.
So once he was, after the solitary confinement, he was transferred to what's known as Villa Vrard, where he would remain for the next 4 years. And they cropped his hair and gave him an inmate uniform that he had to wear. And because he was now diagnosed as exhibiting a syndrome of incurable paranoid delirium, there was no attempt at any treatment for 4 years. He was just transferred from ward to ward aimlessly 17 times over the course of this 4 years.
So they're just transferring him and keeping him on drugs.
Yeah.
That's it. For 4 years.
For 4 years. Actually, at this time, psychiatric medication did not really exist.
Okay.
The first antipsychotic was developed in the 1950s. It was called Thorazine.
Okay.
So this is just predating that. I feel like he probably could have benefited in the world of modern psychiatry.
Of course.
But unfortunately, he was born in a different time. So during this time, actually, the war had broken out, the Second World War. And because of this, asylums were given rations. Starvation rations, and he lived for 4 years off of nothing but cabbage soup.
Oh my God.
And he became so emaciated that his mother thought he was going to die, because he was described as being just a walking skeleton. And so his mother spoke to one of his old surrealist friends and beseeched them to find a more humane institution to transfer him to. And so on February 10th, 1943, so this is many years later now, he's still in asylums. 1943, he's transferred to what is known as the Rodez Asylum. And this is the most important part of this mid-period of his life, I would say. For the first months of his confinement, there wasn't any attempt at treatment because he was still quite delirious. And during this time, though, he made valiant attempts to express his thoughts, despite claiming there are doubles and initiates, which were stealing not only his mind, but his bodily fluids as well.
So he is still having psychotic issues, but he's also starting to come back a sense of his own. Yeah.
He's referring to his original in the correspondence with Jacques Riviere. He's talking of this force is preventing him from thinking. Now he's colorizing that and saying that there are beings, there are people performing magical acts that are confining him, preventing him from speaking the truth. And it's during this time that he started creating what are known as spells. You asked me about this earlier, and so spells, they would alternately be created to either protect him and his friends from these magical powers, or to condemn and destroy his enemies. And so they were bits of writing that he would write on pieces of paper and burn holes in them with his cigarettes to seal them and to signify the destruction that he wanted to impose on his enemies.
Right. So if anyone was a fan of Lady Babylon, there was an episode where, I can't remember which one, where Rob actually shows one of these spells. And this is a spell that Artaud had cast against his landlady that calls for her to be killed.
Yes.
Pretty deep stuff.
Absolutely. And he would mail these out to various friends and enemies. And many people actually kept them. And I have a book called Drawings and Portraits that has many of his drawings. And it includes some of these spells that people have kept and that are in archives and private collections. And they're quite fascinating to look at. And it gives like descriptive translations of what he's saying in them. And it's very profound. And so there's a description here. He would begin
just for my magical friends too. I just wanted to say, looking at the spells, they really remind me, if anyone's familiar with the art of like Austin Osman Spare, it reminds me a lot of sigil magic, this incorporation of kind of like statements with an image and then the seal, so lots of classical magic stuff going on there. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Absolutely. No, that's okay. Speaking of magic and speaking of speaking, he would, he's quoted here as he would begin telescoping his syllables, indulge in verbal gyrations, and make strange noises, changing his intonation and the vocal range of which he was a master, speaking first in a sonorous and then monotonous and finally in an insipid register, whereupon he would break out in mellow and full tones. At other times, hours were spent in articulating words forcefully, interjecting each syllable with a kind of metallic ringing sound, treating words as something concrete, actual beings possessing potential magic forces. For the non-initiated or those unable to understand Artaud, these syllable words seemed to blossom forth helter-skelter, but for Artaud, they created a tapestry of verbal images and rhythms. And he would start incorporating these syllable words as blocks of text into his writing and his drawings.
Wow. To create a rhythm, right? Like to give it a kind of a musical cadence.
Exactly. So people describe what he's saying as glossolalia, but I think that's really undermining the importance of it, because he's very deliberate in the sounds that he's creating and replicating, and he's speaking like a personal mystical language.
Wow.
But for him is life affirming and charging. And unfortunately, because of this, he's the doctor who oversaw Rodez, Dr. Ferdier, started to use electroshock on him because he's talking about magic.
Oh no.
And so for people who don't know much about this, it's very different than modern electroconvulsive therapy, which is actually a treatment I'm trying to get myself. It's very humane. Electroshock was a precursor to electroconvulsive therapy. The science was not very well understood. And very importantly, there was no anesthetic or muscle relaxants given to the patients. So they were completely awake while this machine was using electricity to induce a seizure. And this was performed on him 51 times. There's a record medical document stating it was 51 times. Dr. Ferdier says in his book that he released, I Treated Antonin Artaud, he claimed that he cured him through 4 or 5 sessions of electroshock and drawing therapy or writing therapy. And we have medical records saying that this was performed on him 51 times. So he's flat out lying to make himself look better.
Right.
And
Artaud is not cured, as we well know.
As we well know, he was not cured. His mental state and his emotions fluctuated wildly during this period, regardless of when he was being given the treatments or not. But what's important is that near the end, he started to write and draw again. Typically, he was drawing. And these drawings became like a bridge into writing again.
So he's still in the asylum. They give him all of this electroshock treatment. Why did they stop? So what is that happens to him from that?
So during one of these treatments, because he wasn't on muscle relaxants, from muscle contractions, he shattered his 9th vertebrae and was bedridden for months on painkillers. And then once he was healed, they continued the sessions. And during one of these experiences, so electroshock would induce something called electroshock coma. And so for about 15 to 30 minutes after the treatment, the patient is comatose because it was such a severe electrical shock being used. And during one of these treatments, or I'm reluctant to call them treatments.
Yeah, of course.
Sessions, we'll say. He had not recovered 90 minutes after the treatment. And Dr. Ferdier inspected him and found no signs of life in him. And requested some attendants to come and bring him to the morgue. And as they were preparing his body and putting it on a stretcher, he suddenly jolted awake, alive again.
Holy crap. So he had a literal death and rebirth experience. This,
Yeah.
like you said, this was his apocalypse. He foresaw his own apocalypse.
This was his apocalypse. And I'd like to read a fragment of a writing that he had from this time, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
He says, I died at Rodez under electroshock. I died, legally and medically died. And I shall indeed never forget that corridor of revulsion and asphyxia through which the criminal mob of beings forces the patient in extremis before letting go of him. At the bedside of a dying man, there were more than 10,000 beings, and I took note of this at that moment. There was a conscious unanimity among all these beings, who were unwilling to let the dead man come back to life before he has paid them by giving up his corpse totally and absolutely. For existence will not give even his inert body back to him, in fact, especially his body. The electroshock accomplished, this one didn't run its course as had the first two. I felt that it wasn't going away. I could no longer be my body. I didn't want to be this breath turning to death all around it until its extreme dissolution. Where to get out was the only thought leaping in my throat, blocked and secured on all sides. Every wall of charred meat assured me it would neither be through the soul nor the mind. All that is of a former world. This is what each heartbeat told me. It is the body that will remain without the mind, i.e. the patient. So that is a very pared down recounting of his own personal experience. And he would actually begin to talk about
but it's I just want to make it someone who could write that kind of personal experience like that should not be institutionalized in the way that they have been institutionalized for the last 9 years.
Not at all. Not at all. And I don't want to dive too deeply into what he gets into next, because that's a whole other discussion. But
yeah, we should start to wind down here for sure.
Yeah, I would just like to say as a bridge that when he's describing this mob of beings, the 10,000 beings at the bedside of a dying man, he starts attributing this to the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the state of Bardo.
Oh, wow.
And he starts talking about how electroshock creates a false Bardo state, which is the 40-day period between life and death, where you are either reborn or you achieve nirvana. And he believes that it creates a false death that your body, that your spirit undergoes, and it thinks that it's going to ascend, but then you come back to life again, and you're once again trapped in yourself.
Oh, wow.
Very
That's horrific.
Absolutely horrific. So we can dive more into that next time. But I wanted to just touch on the asylums and the importance of Rodez as being integral to his initiation back into creating again, because he didn't create anything at all during the other asylum periods. It wasn't until then that he started embracing magic and creation.
Okay, I see. So, okay, wow. Let's just kind of recap here. So, yeah, we have, because it's such a profound and intense story. Right?
It is.
So, we have this man from his early life. He's this very creative but very troubled person. And right from early on, he has this mix with mental institutions, right? He gets put into an asylum early on that on one hand inspires him creatively, helps him with some medication, but also gives him this addiction, this lifelong addiction to opiates, right? But this creativity and this ability to thrive within the institution during his early adulthood allows him then in his around 25, right? He goes out and becomes sort of like this creative person, and writing all this poetry. He connects up with the surrealists, right? And from there, he gets into film and into doing the theater, right? And this is where his massive contributions come in, and where he really kind of shows his deep creativity in this magical understanding, is in this theater of cruelty, right?
Yes, theater of cruelty. And I just want to drive home again that I truly believe that it is this pursuit of metaphysics and mysticism that allowed him to persevere through these hardships.
Right.
As we see him trying again and again to use magic to connect with himself, to connect with the world, this all being. And I think that without that, he maybe would have perished in the asylums.
Yeah.
Maybe he might not have emerged, and I think that it's important that just drives home, I think, the importance of mysticism in our lives. And that's something that with the theater of cruelty, the Alfred Jarry theater, that's what he was trying to drive home to his audiences, that they need mysticism to connect with themselves and something greater than themselves.
You know what? It's kind of wild when you think about Artaud. He's almost a play. His life becomes a theater of cruelty.
Absolutely. He dramatizes his own life.
Yeah, he mythologizes himself. He dramatizes his own life, and his life is used to tell his story. So, I know this. I don't want to lessen the severity of anything he goes through, but it almost seems destined to happen, because in order to drive home the points he's trying to make about everything, about how cruel and unforgiving the natural world is, you have to kind of experience that cruelty, and that cruelty destroys him, but also rebirths him anew. And it creates this legacy to the point where we're still talking about him, right?
Absolutely.
So this is something that I think also it's like important to understand, is that a lot of people, right, they look at magicians and they want a magician who, they think that a magician is going to be going down a specific path to become rich and famous, right? Artaud was definitely not on the path to riches and fame. They were on the path of transformation, of self-transformation, and becoming an image to stand the test of time. And in that regard, they definitely succeeded, right?
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah, this has been a wonderful talk, and we've just touching. We've just covered the first half of this man's life, right?
Yeah.
Think about that. He's just had his death and his rebirth. Now we're about to get into Artaud the magician. So
yes.
We're hoping we'll come back next week with Graham, and we'll do the same thing again, where Graham's going to give us a big deep dive into the last half of his life, and then we'll also do sort of reflection on his artistic works. So before we finish up here, is there anything you want to say? Any thoughts you want to leave us with from Artaud in his early life?
I would like to end with actually an Artaud quote, if that's okay.
Of course.
I figure that'd be fitting. And it is a testament to himself and also to, I think, many creators. And he says, "The duty of the writer, of the poet, is not to cowardly shut himself away in a text, a book, a magazine from which he will never emerge, but on the contrary, to emerge, to go outside, to shake, to attack the mind of the public. If not, what use is he?"
Wow. What more, you don't get much more profound than that. Perfect way to end this discussion. Lastly, I just want to say, please give all of your love and thanks to Graham. Please go down to the link in below and check out their poetry publishing house. What is it called again? It's like
Things in My Chest. Yes.
And you have a couple different black metal bands, if I remember right. You're in one thing with Moses.
I'm no longer working in like black metal per se, but I have a metal band called Ghosts of Shadow Moses.
Right.
We're taking a little bit of a break right now, but we recently put out an album earlier this year, and a couple of our songs in the future actually have to do with Artaud. So very excited for that.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to add that link to your band so that everyone can go check that out. And
thank you.
Yeah, go check out their poetry, because they're an incredible poet. And make sure you guys come back for next week when we dive into part 2 of our talk on Antonin Artaud. So much love, everyone. Peace and good night.